During more than 50 years since the resolution was passed, no Palestinian refugee has ever been repatriated. We asked Jess Ganan to explain why.
You know, the right of return is not a new concept, and it's not necessarily new at all for Palestinians, or specific to Palestinians, rather. It's a concept that actually has a very long history. It's a concept that applies to lots of different groups, and even in the relatively recent modern era, we have lots of examples of refugees being afforded the right to return to their homes. More recently, for example, there are examples after the war in Afghanistan, Afghan refugees were allowed to return home. In Bosnia, refugees were allowed to return home. And there are just literally hundreds of examples that after warlike conditions or the actual consequences of war where a refugee problem has been committed and refugees are guaranteed and afforded the right to return to their homes. So it seems rather remarkable that all these examples where refugees are allowed to return to their homes historically for as long as we have recorded history, but for some reason Palestinian refugees are excluded from that kind of right, that kind of inalienable right, that non-negotiable right. For some reason it seems like Palestinians have never been afforded that right, even though all these other refugees have had that opportunity to return to their homes. And there's three places within international law that guarantee a refugee's right, and specifically the Palestinian right to return to their homes. There's the International Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees that refugees can return to their homes. There's the Geneva Convention, which governs the action of, the actions of the consequences of war basically during war and after war, which guarantees that Palestinians and the refugees have a right to return. And then there's UN Resolution 194, of which Israel is a signatory to, which guarantees that Palestinian refugees at the earliest possible time should be afforded the right to return to their homes. So it's not just to the country of origin, it's specifically to the village and home of origin. And so we have it basically enshrined at three levels of international law that the Palestinian right of return is guaranteed.
Dr. Ganan compares the Palestinian right of return to the Jewish law of return, which grants all Jews the right to settle in Israel.
The Jewish law of return is actually quite disturbing if we kind of look at it dispassionately. And what it basically says is that a Jew anywhere in the world has the right to return to the state of Israel, irrespective of their birth history, irrespective of their ethnicity, irrespective of whatever historical trajectory that they themselves have been. And it has gotten even to the more ludicrous level where recently a 400 Peruvian indigenous Indians were brought into Israel, into settlements in the West Bank, who were converted essentially a month before their arrival. These were indigenous native Peruvian Indians who had been converted to Christianity, who were going through very stark poverty conditions in Peru, and who were given this opportunity by the government of Israel to actually come into West Bank settlements if they converted to Judaism, which they did. Now that, in my mind, seems bizarre, because here we have indigenous Peruvian Indians coming to Palestine and having the right to go into a settlement on Palestinian land, and I, as a Palestinian, have no right to do that. It seems rather bizarre that, again, one religious group is privileged over another and is afforded the right to return to a land for which they have no connection to. Yet a Palestinian, like myself, whether they're Christian or Muslim, has no right at this point to return to their home. And frankly, that just seems like naked racism to me. And it's part of this racist structure that the state of Israel is built on, where one group is privileged over another. There are color problems, also, because if you look at the kind of racism that exists in Israel right now, there's a deep kind of racist divide between Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship Palestinian Arabs who are Christians and Muslims who are treated as fourth-class citizens. And then you have this whole kind of color spectrum within Israel, like Ethiopian or black Jews, for example, are treated horrifically and kind of ghettoized, much like African Americans have been ghettoized in the United States and throughout the world. And at the top of the privilege heap are basically white European Jews. And so you have the same racist structure that this country, the United States, had to confront during the civil rights era, which we still confront, is endemic within Israel right now. And in my mind, this idea of like the law of return based on a religious ideology is rather ridiculous. I mean, I would ask people to kind of think about it. What would happen in the United States, for example, if we said only Christians could come to the United States? It would be ridiculous. It just doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And I think it's time that people confronted this kind of exclusionary structure that exists right now, this kind of racism that exists, and it's time to really confront this head on. Notwithstanding the guarantee of Palestinian and all refugees the right to return home based on international law, we also have this kind of given inalienable right that an individual Palestinian refugee or any refugee has to return to their home, and no treaty, no government can sign away that individual inalienable right. So we see that refugees, and specifically Palestinian refugees, in terms of their right to return to their homes, are supported by both international law, which guarantees it, as well as this inalienable individual right that a specific refugee has. The complexities involved with compensation are truly, you know, it's a very complex issue for many reasons. Specifically, the issue of compensation typically gets looked at as either compensation in lieu of the right of return or in exchange for the right of return, when in fact, with contemporary analyses, the way we really look at it is that there should be compensation in addition to the right of return. In other words, it's an individual choice of the specific refugee or refugee family. I mean, if a Palestinian refugee is afforded their right to return to their home, not only should they be given that right, but they should also be afforded compensation. If someone chooses not to return to their home, that's a different equation in terms of compensatory, in terms of compensation or any kind of compensatory analysis. So without going into the details, I think that that particular question will best be addressed once, you know, refugees are allowed to go home.
But how could such a small country as Israel possibly absorb all these refugees without destroying its character and identity? Ganan explains.
You know, Israel is so small, there's no room for the refugees to return. And oh my God, all these refugees, there's no room. But actually, Dr. Abu Sitta, a Palestinian demographer, has done really groundbreaking work on this, and he's really come to a rather extraordinary conclusion. Number one, he found that, for example, that about 80% of Israelis live on only 15% of Israel. Now, I think that's really an important statistic, so I want to say it again. The overwhelming majority of Israelis only live on 15% of the land. So clearly, there is room. There's plenty of room. If the majority of Israelis are only living on 15% of the land of Palestine, that means that Palestinian refugees can come back and that there is plenty of room. Here's another very important statistic. Let's say of the 514 Palestinian villages that were depopulated in 1948, where refugees were forcibly removed from their homes, 90% of those villages remain empty and unpopulated to this day. So I think it's important to realize that, number one, there is room, and the overwhelming majority of villages that were depopulated still exist today. I think that they need to get over, Jews really need to confront their self-deception about this issue, and that clearly what is happening is that these fears are not founded. Any society that's based on immorality any society that's based on racism, hatred, and bigotry, which is really what the Israeli society is built on now, is going to have a paradoxical effect, and that the only way for Jews to feel safe, the only way for people in the larger Middle East to feel safe, is to afford Palestinians the right to be treated equally, is to afford Palestinians the right to self-determination, to afford Palestinians the right to equal freedoms among all the other peoples of the land of Palestine, and allow Palestinian refugees to come home. If they are afforded that, just like Jews lived freely in Palestine before 1948, again, Palestine can become a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, tolerant society as it was before 1948. And there will be no fear whatsoever. Continuing with the current form of occupation, the current form of oppression, the current form of home demolitions, and targeted assassinations, and the brutality of the occupation that the Israelis are engaged in right now is only going to create an atmosphere where, of course, it's not going to be safe for anybody. So once the Israelis are able to confront the immorality of what they're doing, the fundamental racist structure of their society, if they're willing to turn that around, then truly Jews, Christians, and Muslims will be able to live harmoniously and freely, as I said, as they did before 1948 in Palestine.
In April of 2004, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and U.S. President George Bush reached an agreement. In exchange for an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, the Palestinian refugees' right of return would be relinquished. No Palestinian refugees were consulted in this decision. Whether two heads of state have the authority to negate a long-standing UN resolution is an open question. For their part, supporters of Israel's position point out that only a small fraction of the original refugees remain alive, that because of ties to terrorist groups. Many refugees are disqualified to live in peace with their neighbors, and, in any case, a UN General Assembly resolution is not legally binding. Today, most of the villages that were abandoned in 1948 lie in ruins or have long ago been built over by Israeli developments. Yet, despite all this, the refugees remain, numbering nearly 4 million. They are scattered in 58 camps in 4 different countries and inhabit scores of other countries. And they are just as determined as ever to reclaim what they believe is rightfully theirs.